Welcome to Modern Dogma, a Christian considering today's ideas. I'm your host, Elias. Welcome back to Modern Dogma. Welcome to episode 2. I hope everyone is well. So with all the civil unrest that is happening in the United States these days, I've seen some Christians perpetuating the notion that before we rush to condemn violence or rioting or looting, we need to first condemn systemic racism that is causing the rioting. Or in other words, the sinful violence we are witnessing, people's livelihoods being burned down, many black-owned, people's businesses being looted, police officers being harmed. There's a common sentiment that such acts of sin are just a reflection of the systemic brokenness in our nation. So again, before we condemn acts of sinful rioting, we need to condemn the sinful system of racism in our nation. So I discussed in episode 1 the fact that we, as biblically minded Christians, if we want to consistently uphold the Bible's teachings that this world is fallen and Jesus has sovereignly given temporary, limited rulership of this world to Satan, we should expect to see sin of every kind, including racism, embedded within the systems of our society. So we address the fact that systemic sin is real. It's manifested in all sorts of ways. Racism is just one example. God has, through particular unusual times in history, greatly limited its effects, but by God's design, it won't disappear completely until Jesus' return. But let's break down this attitude that before we condemn acts of sinful rioting, we need to condemn systemic racism. Let's take a deeper look at what this statement is saying in the context of how it is being used by secular social justice advocates. On the one hand, if we are making such a statement purely in a chronological sense, there's technically some validity here. In other words, if you're simply making the statement, sin A happened first, and then sin B happened afterwards, so let's condemn sin A first, and then right afterwards, let's condemn sin B. Let's make sure they both get their day in court, but we can't deal with them simultaneously, so let's do A and then B. If that is what is being stated, then the statement, before we condemn sinful rioting, we need to condemn systemic racism, has some sense to it, even though there are still some significant problems with that statement. So let's say, for example, Peter goes out and robs Bill of $100. And then Bill, because he is out $100, Bill goes out and robs Mary. If the social justice advocate is then looking at the situation and merely saying, before we condemn Bill for robbing Mary, we need to first, chronologically, condemn Peter for robbing Bill, but then after we put Peter in prison, we'll deal with Bill, then okay, your statement at least makes some logical sense, even though you're not really saying much of anything. I mean, what was so controversial with someone saying Peter and Bill are both thieves and both of their acts of thievery are wrong that you felt so compelled to have to respond with, yeah, but before you condemn Bill, you need to condemn Peter? Okay, but are you disagreeing with me that Bill also did a pretty scummy thing by robbing Mary? Am I not allowed to state in the same sentence the obvious ideal outcome here, that both Peter and Bill should go to jail? I mean, is that not the clearer, more valuable thing to state if I were the district attorney or whatever? Would that not be the right thing to say to my constituents? Look, we have 2 thieves here. We're going to make sure they both receive the justice they deserve for their crimes. Justice is impartial. It doesn't ultimately matter who stole first. They are both going to get their day in court, and we are going to deal with both cases. And yet, the world seems to be blowing its top when someone dares to speak biblical justice into the situation we're seeing today and condemn both the killing of George Floyd and also the rioting and looting we saw in the aftermath. And I'm not surprised that the world has this perverse, biased view of justice, but it's a shame that even some Christians are being sucked into the lie that justice can be one-sided. So, I mean, if you're just speaking in a chronological sense, we need to address Peter's theft first, and then we need to deal with Bill's theft. We need to deal with George Floyd's killing first, and then we need to deal with the rioters. Yeah, that's technically true, but what is the point of what you just stated? What do you think you're clarifying by responding with that after someone has the nerve to state, Peter and Bill are both thieves, Peter and Bill are both wrong? You know, the cop that killed George Floyd and the rioters are both wrong. What was so wrong and controversial with that statement? It's about as useful as stating, yeah, but it was 1 o'clock before it was 2 o'clock. Okay, thank you for telling me about the passage of time. What are you adding to this conversation? Am I not allowed to state the obvious, that 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock both occur during a day? Am I not allowed to state in the same sentence, in the same day, in the same year, when two different parties are both committing a sin that offends God? So I take the time to address this first chronological interpretation of the sentiment. Before we condemn acts of sinful rioting, we need to condemn systemic racism, because some Christians are standing by this statement using this first way of interpreting it. Because technically, this first chronological way of interpreting this statement is logically correct. But what I hope I just demonstrated is that although this statement is technically true, if this is really what non-Christians in the world mean by this statement, it's actually a non-idea. There's actually no substance to saying the chronological order of justice should be 1, punish those perpetuating racism in society, and then afterwards, 2, punish rioters. It's like, okay, sure, we can't punish both at the exact same time because I can't be in two places at once. Sure, that's technically true, but we're still going to punish both in a reasonable window of time, right? But the problem is, this isn't what the secular social justice advocate is saying. You see, whenever we want to do the work of interpretation, we need to make sure we are reading and listening to the statement in the context of what the author or speaker meant to say. That's where meaning comes from. So, what is being stated by the social justice advocate that says, before we rush to condemn sinful rioting, we need to first condemn systemic injustice? This isn't being asserted in a chronological time sense. It's being stated in a morally relativistic sense, and that's what makes this idea unbiblical. In other words, the speaker here is asserting, oh, you think burning down innocent people's businesses and killing people that work in law enforcement is wrong? Well, guess what? Upholding a system of injustice is more wrong. So that makes rioting relative to the more wrong thing of systemic injustice not a big deal. The system of injustice did the wrong thing first. Quit your pearl clutching. Do you hear the 6-year-old in that statement? The argument is basically, he started it. Look, again, like I said in my first episode, I'm not saying any of these things to make anyone feel dumb. I'm not purposefully trying to offend you if you thought or said this recently. And by the way, I'm not thinking of any particular person that I know, okay? This is really stuff that I actually see, like, on the internet among strangers. And I'm not using the analogy of a 6-year-old to be condescending. I'm trying to draw your attention to the obvious fact that you should instinctively understand, especially if you are a parent of a young child, that when your kid uses the argument, he started it, to justify some sin, it's not a very compelling excuse. When your 6-year-old uses the argument, he broke my toy first, that's why I broke his, how should we respond? We discipline both siblings, don't we? That's true biblical justice, not social justice, true justice. Justice is impartial. And sure, we can mete out that justice chronologically. We can deal with the first kid that broke the toy, and then we can deal with the second kid that broke the other toy. But we don't let the second kid off the hook because he's screaming, he broke my toy first. We don't delay the second kid's time out by a month because we first need to address the first kid's act of breaking his brother's toy. And yet the false teaching being pushed today is if you, as a Christian, condemn both the killing of George Floyd and also the destruction of people's livelihoods and the killing of cops, you are somehow lumped together with the KKK. I mean, wow, the world just cannot help but overreact. It is 0 to 100 with progressives throughout history. You are either 100% affirming of all of their stances, you either think exactly like them on every point, or you're a Klansman. Those are the two options the world gives us as Christians. There's no, can we tease out the nuances here? There's no, wait, you have a partial point here, but you're wrong about this part. It's, you think exactly like us, or you're a racist, Trump-supporting, black people lynching lunatic. The world cannot help but overreact to everything. They are emotion-driven. The Bible says for such people, their God is their stomach. In other words, they are led around by their appetites, their emotions, their feelings. They can't listen. They can't think rationally when they're angry. They get punched on the nose and then they just start swinging at everyone in the room recklessly without any discretion. But we Christians can think rationally. Whether or not we actually do all the time is another question, but we are able to. We have that potential. We are able to have cooler heads and be slow to speak and quick to listen because we are equipped with God's Spirit living in our hearts and minds that gives us the power of self-control. One of the fruits of the Spirit, Galatians 5:23. And can I exhort the church today to practice a little self-control and not let an admittedly disturbing video of a black man being choked to death by a cop cause you to totally lose your minds and stop thinking biblically? Can we please stop jumping to conclusions about other Christians' motives? Stop letting your emotions run wild, and let's actually deal with what is happening in our country according to God's perspective. You know, there's a great illustration in the fact that God's abode is pictured as towering above us millions of miles in the air. This idea that heaven is far above us is a great analogy of how we ought to think about anything that happens on this earth. Instead of getting sucked into the world's way of thinking and the world's base, emotion-driven, hot takes, instead of feeling the need to immediately inject your opinion before you have all the facts, we need to coolly rise above such rash, thinly informed opinions and use the Bible to condemn what needs to be condemned on all sides of the political spectrum and uphold what needs to be upheld. The Bible teaches very clearly that you never respond to sin with more sin. You never respond to a killing by murdering cops. You don't respond to injustice by committing more injustice. What was one of the first Sunday school lessons you had when you were a child? Wasn't it Jesus' teaching to turn the other cheek? I mean, a little child in Sunday school right now can tell you the right way to respond to George Floyd. And that should make some of us that are walking lockstep with the world's out-of-control rage feel very ashamed. Why are we Christians so confused about rioting? How did we get so mixed up about right and wrong? How did morality start looking so relative to us? Moral relativism. This idea that what is right and what is wrong changes based on each circumstance you're in. That's a wrong, anti-biblical idea. Evil is always evil. Good is always good. Do you know why morality is static, by the way? It's not just because God said so and His word never changes, even though that's true. It's actually even more fundamental than that. It's because morality, the standard for good and evil, is actually rooted in God's character. God Himself is the reflection of what goodness is. And anything that is not like God is, by definition, evil. It is evil to murder someone because God is not a murderer. It is evil to loot someone's business because God is not a thief. And God does not change. That's James 1:17. That's why moral relativism is unbiblical. And by the way, we aren't taught to turn the other cheek because we should just let sin slide. We turn the other cheek as a way to humbly admit to God, I'm not smart enough. I'm not wise enough. I'm certainly not impartial enough here to dole out perfect justice in this evil, unjust situation. So God, I entrust to you, dole out that perfect justice when you come back to earth. Romans chapter 12, verse 19 states, Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. So where in the Bible do you see Jesus teaching us to respond to someone's sin by sinning against them back? Which chapter of the Gospel of John was it where Jesus suffered the systemic injustice of all the religious and political leaders persecuting him and trying to trap him and then ultimately crucifying him on the cross? And then Jesus responded by telling his disciples to rise up with swords and ransack Jerusalem? Wait a minute, what did Jesus say when he was hanging on the cross? Father, forgive them. Forgive my oppressors, because they know not what they do. So on the one hand, one of the worst hot takes regarding the riots proliferating in our culture today is that you can't condemn rioting because someone else did something bad first. And by the way, as a side note, I love how the someone else did something bad first, the world's concept of systemic racism, is so undefinable. It's undefinable by design. When you ask a typical BLM supporter in the street to tell you exactly who specifically is at fault for systemic racism, who specifically they're angry at, it's impossible to pin down an answer. Just saying white people as a whole is not a very compelling answer. That is lazy thinking. You're not suggesting the solution to what you define as systemic racism is the genocide of all white people, are you? However you even define white people anyway. I mean, all these categories are man-made. Like, what percentage of Irish are we calling white people? What shade of white is too white? What if they had a tan? What do we do with people with a black mom and white dad? Oh, okay, so you're not saying we should kill all white people? Okay, then who exactly is guilty of systemic injustice, according to your definition? Because I'm looking for a practical solution here as a Christian. I'm looking for some specific names of people we need to arrest and put in prison so we can solve systemic racism. But no, as much as systemic racism exists, and again, it does exist, the way the world defines it and talks about it, it is undefinable by design, because the end goal here isn't actually solving anything. The end goal is the same goal as Satan's goal. Did you know Satan is called our accuser in the Bible? Look up Revelation 12, verse 10. Satan's goal and BLM's goal is to just lump accusation and condemnation on people. There's no path toward redemption. There's no path toward forgiveness and reconciliation. There's no clear definition of the problem, which would lead to a clear definition of the solution. So even if they take a chronological view of injustice, where they are arguing systemic racism needs to be addressed before we punish the rioters, they cannot tell you exactly when systemic racism has finally been addressed so we can move on to punishing rioters. So basically, effectively, the rioters will never be punished because systemic racism will never be properly dealt with according to the BLM's and social justice advocates' nebulous, undefinable standard. That's par for the course for any worldly doctrine, by the way. There's no solution. There's never a chance to fix things. Satan just wants to accuse and complain. He doesn't want things being mended. It's like the meme, I don't want a solution, I want to be mad. There's another wrong view on the rioting that's closely related to the he started it moral relativism idea, and that's the false dogma of pragmatism. Pragmatism can be best defined by the old adage, the ends justify the means. Kelly Carter Jackson in The Atlantic conveyed this take on the riots in her piece from June 1st, where she writes, quote, Black people understand the utility of riotous rebellion. Violence compels a response. Violence disrupts the status quo and the possibility of returning to business as usual. So often, the watershed moments of historical record are stamped by violence. It is the engine that propels society along from funerals to fury and from moments to movements. I love how Kelly Jackson, by the way, lumps all black people into one monolithic category. Like she can speak for all black people on this topic. I mean, that's pretty much the definition of racism. But I think Jackson gives a pretty accurate portrayal of how much of the BLM movement and its allies feel about the riots today. As I stated before, I don't really care what the world's opinion is on things. I don't really get too upset when I see a talking head on mass media chiming in with their uninformed, unbiblical opinion on a matter. In a sense, we should actually feel sympathy for folks that are trapped in a cycle that Jesus called the blind leading the blind. What I get very disheartened over is when we Christians that are equipped with the Holy Spirit and the Holy Word fall for this stuff and end up thinking just like the rest of the world. I mean, if I can get off on a tangent here, if we want to talk about systemic injustice that is in the fabric of our society today, I think you can make the case that a large part of the blame rests on the heads of us Christians that were entrusted with the light of God's Word, and yet we've been failing to convey that light to a dark world. The world is a bunch of blind men and women groping around in the darkness, and they're about to fall right off a cliff because they don't know any better. And then God graciously gave a few of us eyes to see, and He gave us one job to do. Tell these people where the cliff is and plead with them to turn around. And yet so many of us, paralyzed with fear over what the world would think about us, or utterly confused because we've been listening to social media rather than God's word, so many of us are just standing around letting people fall off the cliff. So who do you blame in that scenario? The blind people or people with sight that were supposed to act as a guide? Now, that analogy isn't perfect, so don't push it too far. There's also a measure of guilt that the people falling off the cliff have as well, but that's not my point here. Anyway, let's return to the Atlantic here. What Kelly Jackson is stating in this article is probably a familiar opinion to you by now. Rioting is good, or at least morally neutral, because of the good result it produces. Or at the very least, yeah, rioting is bad, but it's like a white lie level of bad because the result that it produces is so good. It totally outweighs a little bit of bad that rioting morally is. Rioting is causing society to talk about racism. Rioting is putting political pressure on leaders to pass reforms. Rioting is forcing people to have to confront these systemic injustices and not just ignore it. So this is called pragmatism. The ends justify the means. You can do whatever you need to do in order to produce some good conclusion, as you define as good. By the way, Congressman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, early on in her career, in a rare moment of honesty, said point blank that this was her operating ideology. In an interview with Anderson Cooper, when she was asked why she was pushing fake statistics, she responded, "I think there's a lot of people more concerned about being precisely, factually, and semantically correct than about being morally right." In other words, it's okay to lie if your cause is just. If the end conclusion is some righteous cause, it doesn't matter what sinful thing you do to get there. This ideology causes a lot of Christians to get confused, and yet God has packed the Bible with endless illustrations to show the foolishness and ultimate futility of pragmatism. Scripture is clear that pragmatic thinking, I'm going to commit the sin because my cause is just, always ends up perpetuating more sin and perpetuating more tragedy, and ultimately ending in your condemnation by God's judgment. It was a pragmatic thing for the Pharisees and the Sadducees to murder Jesus. As the high priest Caiaphas said in John 11:50, it is better that we kill Jesus rather than let the Romans come and kill us all because we're letting this rabble-rouser cause an uprising. You see, the Jews were scared that Jesus' exploding popularity at that point in Jesus' ministry would lead to the Jews revolting against Roman rule, which would cause Caesar to send the military and destroy Israel. So the Pharisees and Sadducees thought, yeah, it's wrong to murder this man Jesus, but the ends justify the means. We do this little sinful thing, but look at the net benefit. The peace of the nation is preserved. And I don't think I really need to elaborate on what God's opinion was on his son being murdered, do I? Yes, God's sovereign plan was for the Son to die for the sins of God's children, but that doesn't take away from the fact that God condemns those evil people that murdered Jesus. I think another biblical illustration that illuminates God's opinion of pragmatism is the story of Dinah in Genesis 34. I mean, this story can be applied almost directly to the George Floyd and BLM and Antifa protests today. Dinah was the sister of the 12 sons of Jacob, and in Genesis 34, we are told that Dinah went out one day to hang out with some of the local women when Shechem, the prince of the land, seized Dinah and raped her. Now, I cannot imagine a worse thing ever happening to a woman. That was truly an unspeakable, evil act, was it not? How would you respond to your sister being raped? How would the world respond? We see how the world is responding to the evil act of George Floyd being killed. It's the same way the world responds to every atrocity. Commit more atrocities. When there is bloodshed, the world responds with more bloodshed. I mean, why do you think the movie Taken, John Wick are such hits? Vengeance speaks to the sin inside of us. It feels like scratching an itch. We get immediate satisfaction when we take revenge by our own hands. We hate the delayed gratification of waiting for God's perfect judgment in the future. Well, two of Jacob's sons, two of Dinah's brothers, have the same idea, and they hatch a devious plan. You see, after assaulting Dinah, Shechem and his dad meet with Jacob's family and ask them to smooth things over with a treaty. They propose that the two tribes intermarry, have free trade, and Shechem asks in particular to marry Dinah. Jacob's sons respond by pretending to go along with the treaty, but they tell Shechem that before we can become partners, your people have to be circumcised like we are. It's a religious thing. It's important to us. If you don't get circumcised, there's no deal. Shechem and his dad think, great, we'll do that. So they go out and they convince all the males in their tribe to be circumcised so that their people can have this treaty with the Israelites. However, circumcision, as you can guess, is a very painful, debilitating procedure, particularly in ancient times before modern medicine. So after Shechem's people are circumcised, when they're weak and vulnerable, two of Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, sneak into the town and slaughter Shechem and every male in his city, even the little boys. The response was just totally disproportionate. Now, how do you respond to this story? I'll be honest, I have a sister, and the sinner inside me is rooting for Simeon and Levi. Aren't you? Isn't that the temptation? How would contemporary America respond to this story? I can already see the op-ed in the New York Times. Before we condemn Simeon and Levi, we need to talk about the systemic racism and systemic male chauvinism that made it unsafe for an Israelite woman of color to walk in public in the city of Shechem. I can already see the top-voted, nuanced comment in the Reddit thread. Yeah, what Simeon and Levi did was problematic, but I can understand why they did it. Is that so? What's God's opinion? You're going to be disappointed. First of all, this brutal massacre by Simeon and Levi endangered Jacob's whole family. Jacob rebuked his sons by saying, "You made our family stink to the inhabitants of the land. My numbers are few. And if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." And Jacob was 100% correct. The nations surrounding Jacob's family were conspiring to take their own vengeance and kill them for the outrageous thing they did. And that's why God, being merciful, in Genesis 35, verse 5, mercy being something that God didn't have to do, by the way, in Genesis 35:5, God had to cause a supernatural terror to fall on the surrounding cities so they didn't kill Jacob and his family. These two foolish young men, Simeon and Levi, almost got their whole family killed by responding to a horrible sin with even more sin. And then, years later, when Jacob is on his deathbed, God prophesies through Jacob and speaks to Simeon and Levi's actions directly, and it isn't pretty. Genesis 49, starting from verse 5, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter their council. Let me not join their assembly, for they have killed men in their anger and hamstrung oxen as they pleased. Cursed be their anger, so fierce, and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. And that's exactly what happened. Levi's descendants, the tribe of Levi, when all of Israel inherited the promised land, received no land portion. They were truly scattered among Israel. And then Simeon became a small tribe that was totally surrounded by the tribe of Judah, as if they continued to need parental supervision for the rest of Israelite history. You see, Simeon and Levi had a righteous cause, didn't they? They were righteously angry that their dear sister was taken advantage of. They loved Dinah, and they wanted to defend her honor. Yet, that righteous anger quickly turned into evil anger, and they employed sinful means to what they thought was a good end. And at the end of the day, for their pragmatic, morally relativistic way of thinking, God cursed their anger for their cold-blooded massacre of the Shechemites. It's interesting to note that in Genesis 49, God doesn't just condemn them for killing men. They are also condemned, did you catch this? For hamstringing oxen in verse 6. So they were not only guilty of taking life, they were guilty for reckless property damage. Are you seeing the perfect parallels to the George Floyd and the riot situation today? You see, it doesn't matter how righteous you think your cause is. It doesn't matter what atrocity or evil was committed against you. Responding by committing more evil is never justified in God's sight. Responding to sin with more sin just perpetuates the cycle of violence. And that's what we are already seeing and what we will continue to see in our nation in light of the rioting. So as of this recording, on June 30th, it allegedly came to light that there was a private Facebook group of retired police officers and other elements of the political right that were conspiring to assassinate civil rights activist Shaun King. The things that people in this Facebook group were saying about Shaun King was just shockingly despicable. Things like, Shaun King needs to be put down. Kill a commie for mommy. Does anyone know where this Shaun King can be found? Really horrifying things. And I pray for his safety. I'm glad to hear that it sounds like some of these people are being tracked down by, of all people, the police. Super ironic, by the way. But anyway, as much as I wish Shaun King nothing but safety and protection for him and his family, the response from the far non-Christian right is exactly what the Bible warns will happen when instead of turning the other cheek, we continue the cycle of hate. So we saw on Monday, June 29th, a couple of white attorneys in St. Louis stepped out of their property with guns pointed at BLM protesters who apparently were trespassing on private property. The nation is a tinderbox right now, and unless God graciously chooses to intervene, I personally think we are in for some real bloodshed in this country. And these are all the fruits of pragmatic, moral, relativistic thinking. Violent looting gets the nation's attention and forces politicians to do something. Yeah, and it also really agitates actually racist people in this country and other elements of the right wing, who are armed, by the way, with far more guns than the left. And the secular right also has an ideology, this idea of, you better not tread on my liberties or I will respond with overwhelming force. This non-Christian conservative ideology, I'm afraid, will empower the right to respond with a devastatingly violent use of force if they are pushed. That's what we should be worried about. And that's where Christians ought to be stepping into the culture and preaching against escalation. Isn't that also super ironic? The progressives keep talking about how the police need to stop agitating a situation and instead learn peaceful de-escalation techniques. That's a solid point, by the way. Let's give credit where credit is due. And yet, simultaneously, these non-Christian progressives believe the way to get what they want is to escalate the tensions in America with violent rioting. See, non-Christian ideologies always break down somewhere. Logical consistency is a unique attribute of a biblical worldview. Christians, our call is to uphold and preach true justice against any form of injustice and not get sucked into this political tribalism. And in this sense, we strive to imitate God's justice. You see, God's justice is starkly objective. It's actually terrifying how completely uninterested God is in your background story or how tough your life is when He is judging you. Let me say something plainly that you might find shocking. There is no mercy, no grace in God's justice. Don't mishear me. God is gracious and God is merciful, but God is also just. And in God's justice, in upholding the cause of fairness and righting wrongs, there is no leeway. There is no wiggle room. It doesn't matter what your goal was. It doesn't matter what your ends were. If you use sinful means, you have committed sin, and that will be dealt with by God. As a Christian, He'll deal with you with loving parental discipline. And that discipline can be as severe as Him honestly killing you and taking you to heaven because you're causing so much trouble on earth. And for the non-believers that stumbled onto this podcast, if you commit sin, you continue in your life of sin, God will deal with you with eternal condemnation. You see, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 15 states as follows, "You shall do no injustice in court." And listen to how God defines injustice as the verse continues. "You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor." In other words, when you see someone doing something sinful, you should have no regard for his status, class, ethnicity, or whatever. Sin is sin, no matter who is committing it. This is why Lady Justice holding the scales of judgment has a blindfold. And yet, in our world today, because it has bought into the idea of class warfare, if you have a certain skin color, or if you're from a certain arbitrarily defined class identity, or if you're part of a certain political class, you can do no wrong. We Christians equipped with biblical understanding must call out that kind of thinking for what it is, a perversion of justice. Thanks for joining me today on Modern Dogma. Men err, God is sovereign.